Good morning. I see many of you are still joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started. It is 10 a.m. My name is Jen Arbori. I am a partner here at the Bonadeo Group. And also joining me today is my partner, Amanda Della Sala. We're so excited to be kicking off Bonadeo's annual tax-exempt webinar series. We are so excited that you're joining us for the first session this week, which is navigating the complexities of financial grant management. Before we get started, just a couple things. Our presentation materials and the links to today's webinar will be sent to you via email within 2 weeks of the conclusion of the event. If you haven't registered, there is plenty of time. With this being the kickoff session, there is more sessions later today, as well as all throughout the week this week. You can go to our website, bonadeo.com, and search for tax-exempt webinar series, or the link will also be available in the chat for you to click and sign up there as well. Lots of great stuff going on this week. A couple of housekeeping items as the welcome here. As you can see, just make sure you can see the content, speakers and earphones are on, adjusting your audio. I know all these platforms are a little bit different, so some information there. For any questions, please use the chat option. Both Amanda and I will be reviewing these today and addressing questions if it's applicable during the presentation. If not, we'll save questions towards the end. And then as far as steps for CPE, I know there were notes on the side as you were joining as far as logging into Conferences.io and a couple of different methods for doing that. Make sure you do click check in now so you are checked into the session. We will have 4 polling questions. There's no right or wrong answers today. Just choose an answer, click submit. And then at the end, you'll want to check out of the session so that we can ensure you receive your CPE credit. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to give you an overview of what we're going to cover today. And then Amanda's going to start you off in just a moment. But really, our plan today is to give you a grant overview, to give you a little bit of background. We've got all sorts of various levels. We've got funders, we've got nonprofit organizations, and we really want to just give a high-level grant overview. But the bulk of the presentation will really be focused on common challenges and best practices. And we'll kind of work those hand in hand. We'll go through each challenge and we'll talk about what those best practices are. And if there's time, there's a slide on the end, a little bit of future trends that we're seeing relative to the grant space. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Amanda to take you through the beginning of the grant overview.
All right, thank you, Jen. Good morning, everyone. All right, Jen, if you could advance a couple slides, we'll get into the grant life cycle. So this is the end-to-end process of managing a grant. So from the time an organization identifies a grant opportunity until the time the project has been funded, completed, and closed out. So different organizations might use different versions of this grant life cycle, but there's typically 3 stages. First is the pre-award stage. So this is where the nonprofit is performing all of its research, completing those applications. Then we have the actual execution of the contract. So this is when the grantor has accepted your application, any negotiations about maybe terms or the amounts are concluded, and the grantor does formally award the funding to the grantee. And then lastly, we have the post-award phase, which is the final stage that's center on the implementation of the project, as well as all the monitoring, financial reporting, and then eventual closeout and evaluation of the grant. So for the next hour, we are really going to focus on the blue portion of the cycle, the post-award phase of the life cycle. So there are several types of grant funding, and each is going to have its own management and reporting requirements. So starting in the upper right-hand corner with foundation grants, there are 2 main categories here, and that's going to be your private foundations as well as your public charities, both of which supply grant funds to nonprofits. Next, we have federated funds, which is a local organization that raises money from the public or from local businesses and then distributes it to a portfolio of nonprofits. So a very well-known example of a federated fund is the United Way. Next, we have corporate giving. So many corporations will allocate a portion of their profits to grant making through their corporate foundations or as part of their corporate social responsibility programs. And then lastly, we have government grants, which is the largest category with billions of dollars allocated across various sectors. There are different levels of government grants. So nonprofits across the country are eligible to receive federal grant funding. However, a nonprofit can only apply for state grants in the particular state where they belong. And then local grants are either further limited to your specific community, district, or county. But there are no restrictions on how many government grants a nonprofit can research and pursue. So as long as you've determined that your organization meets the eligibility criteria, you can apply for as many of these opportunities as you see fit. So that brings us to polling question number 1, which is, where does most of your grant funding come from? Government, foundations, corporate, or a combination of the above? We'll give you a few more seconds to respond to that. I'm seeing the results come in, and it looks like around 60% is government, and then 36% of you is a combination, with just a few having majority in foundation or corporate. All right, so I do think the poll will stay open for a little bit longer, but we will continue on. So total charitable giving in the US, again, involves billions of dollars, and the nonprofit industry has seen shifts in where the funding originates, but overall grant funding sources are continually increasing year over year. There's just more types of grants available now, and certainly more funder entities, whether that's the federal, state, or local governments, but really more private, public, community foundations, corporate foundations, et cetera. The biggest source of grant funding does come from the discretionary spending budget of the US government, and it is estimated that about 1/3 of nonprofit revenue currently comes from government grants and contracts. So looking at this graph, when we look at the year-over-year trends, funding from foundations has remained the steadiest, with a 35% increase every year, while corporate, individual, and government funding has had more variability, tending to trend up or down given the economic climate. But there remains a 20 to 40% increase across all of these sources year over year. This year, we did see every area dip slightly, except for corporate funding when compared to 2023. But again, all funding sources increasing year over year, and really government funding remaining very high compared to the numbers that we saw back in 2020. All right, so continuing on with a macro look at the grant environment, these are a few trends that we're seeing. First is an increased focus on social impact. There is much more emphasis on projects that address DE&I initiatives, as well as increased funding for climate change and other sustainability initiatives. There's more technology-driven applications. So the use of AI and data analytics in the grant review process has been increasing, and online submission platforms are using more integrated compliance checks than before. There's much more collaborative funding models as well. So the public-private partnerships are gaining traction, where these two groups are teaming up to achieve shared goals and really leverage the strength and resources of both sectors. And there's also more multi-organizational grants that are fostering intersector collaboration. So in the past, you may have been competing against your peers to obtain funding, but we're now seeing those two organizations team up to work together to receive that grant funding. There's also more outcome-based funding, so a much bigger preference for measurable, high-impact results. Funders really want evidence of quantifiable outcomes that align with the broader goals of their grant program. So a real shift from funding just the activities to funding the outcomes. And an example of that is a government might give a grant to an organization to reduce homelessness, but the grant would be tied to measurable outcomes, such as a certain percentage reduction in the homeless population, or a certain number of individuals who would transition to stable housing. And then last trend we have here is increased competition. There's certainly greater demand for grants as the nonprofit sector continues to grow. And this really stresses the importance of strategic and really well-documented proposals and applications. So with that, I will hand it over back to you, Jen.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. So Amanda talked a little bit ago about the categories, the major categories of grants. And so what's on this slide here is really diving a little deeper into what are the types of grants that are available. And really the one that we're going to focus on today and talk more about when we get to the common challenges. I mean, they apply across multiple grants, but it's really in that program grant category. This is, program grants and funding provided for specific programs and projects. Because of this, there's significant spending restrictions. You've got a lot more reporting mechanisms relative to the specificity of what you're doing, and you really may only use the funds for the exact purpose that you've outlined in your grant proposal or that you've outlined in your contract. If we're talking more on the federal or government grant side, we're talking more contracts versus grant side, but really same sphere, same program grants and contracts. The second bucket, don't we all wish we could get an unlimited amount of operational support grants? These would be ideal, but they are a little bit more rare. They are a lot more rare in the nonprofit sphere. Most organizations are not necessarily receiving general operating support. What we are seeing is a little bit more in that second slash on the other side of it, the capacity building. We're seeing a little bit more where funders, private foundations and other funders are looking at capacity building and trying to help nonprofits really strengthen their internal capabilities. So those are meant not to necessarily cover general operating, but to look at where are their weaknesses and where can you strengthen internal capabilities, whether that's governance related, it could be IT. In a lot of cases, we encourage organizations to also keep finance in mind as an area where capacity building could be, really, really important. Moving on to the rest of them there, capital grants, pretty specific capital campaigns, specific building construction, property acquisition projects, research grants, found more on the academia side, but can also have a lot of restrictive qualities to those as well. And then we put in-kind grants because I've actually seen this happening a little bit more, smaller dollars. I had several organizations over the last couple of years who received Google ad grants. They were given $10,000 from Google to do some ad spending. So some in-kind grants, something we're seeing a little bit more. But since each of these types of grants can contribute to the success of your organization in different ways, it's mindful to keep, to kind of keep in mind of, what does that complement look like at your organization? Are we taking advantage of these? Are we focused on program grants? We haven't looked for capacity building options. And so, again, all the various types of grants. And then, what's involved in the grant management process. We kind of have it broken down here into the 3 buckets that you can see. You've got managing grants, capturing all of the costs, performance, impact, and then ensuring you're complying, you're maximizing your opportunities. It really takes strategy and focus to discover the best grant opportunities for your organization, kind of in the manage phase, win them, right? Amanda talked about like the pre versus the post, and then really perform to grantor expectations and requirements. Without a solid grant management process, we see a lot of nonprofits struggle to track grants, to monitor budgets, to meet reporting requirements. And so that middle section at capture, we'll spend a good amount of time on today, where the financial piece, the financial management piece kind of sits in there. And that's where people run into issues with shared costs, the allocations, all of those things that make, managing grants very cumbersome. And while increasing grant funding can really help you build a sustainable future, if you're not building and executing well, there's a lot of things that could kind of go sideways. And if they do, it usually results in potential for lost awards. There could be poor audit results. You do risk reputational damage. In some instances, you see return of funds, and we'll talk about funder relationships coming up in common challenges. The return of funds we see pretty rare. If you can build relationships with your funder, you may need to talk through and be honest with what's going on if there are issues with your grants management, and then difficulty securing future grants. So, really you got to build that relationship in order to continue to secure those grants going forward. So we're going to go ahead and get into all of the common challenges that we see and what are the best practices. And so Amanda and I will cover funder relationships and budget management. And then Amanda will get into data tracking and reporting, technology and resource constraints. And then I'll circle back at the end on compliance and regulatory and impact measurement. So we're going to kick it off with funder relationships. And really, each of these slides is going to kind of outline some challenges and best practices. And then we're going to elaborate on some of those best practices in some additional slides. The main thing with funder relationships, when you look at the challenges that exist, it comes down to communication. I mean, the bullets talk about poor coordination between grantor and grantee and a lack of clarity on deliverables, deadlines, and expectations. I mean, you can kind of sum that all up in communication. And best practice might seem obvious, to build positive collaborative relationships from the start, but you'd be surprised. I've seen many organizations that just look at a funder as a funder, who are afraid of their funders, which is kind of crazy. When you take a step back from it, because they want to give you funds to do great things in the community and to further your mission. So really, there's a couple things here, but I'm going to go ahead and jump to the next slide, because there's a lot more detail relative to the best practices on building funder relationships. But they really are built on trust, accountability, and a shared passion for your mission. They are interested in what's going on in your organization. And so one of the things I always say is, do your research to find the funders that fit the best. I know that when you are an organization and you've got a budget, or you're looking and trying to find those grants, it's like, where are they coming from? We have a budget to meet. It may just come from anywhere. But one of the things that's important in doing your research is finding a fit. And I always love to say this, but if you have met one foundation or funder, you've only met one foundation or funder. And some of you may have heard me say this before. It's not if you've met one funder, you've met them all. They are all very unique. They all have specific things that they're interested in funding. And that holds true for, government, state, federal, all of the agencies. There's various agencies. Obviously, a Department of Health is going to be different from a Department of State. So, really what fits with your organization? Where is that funding going to come from? Communication. I said it on the last slide. It's probably the most important thing that relative to relationships. There's no one size fits all approach to communicating with funders. Talk to them, seek their input. Really what's important to them. And the other thing is to find out how often they want to be communicated with. I've seen some organizations that, love to get the newsletters of the funders that they're working with. Some, the federal government or state government, they just want the reports when they want their reports. Private foundations and other charities, they may be more interested in the work that you're doing. So talk to them, figure out what's important. And then be strategic, have your house in order. We'll talk today about the things that are important relative to the grants management process. They're looking to make sure your organization has financial stability. They're looking to make sure that you are, like Amanda talked about earlier, collaborating with other organizations. The funders love that stuff. And really adopting a genuine and honest collaborative approach. I mentioned reaching out to them, seeking their input. When you have the ear of a funder, if you have 3 ideas on the table, talk to them. They might say, the idea you thought was the greatest idea isn't the greatest idea, and that there's an opportunity on a different program potentially to be funded. So really, if you got their ear and you can build that relationship, it's huge. So we're going to jump into polling question number 2. How many individual grants or contracts, if they're maybe government or state related, is your organization currently managing? 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 20, 21 to 40, over 40. Give you guys a couple seconds to kind of work on your response there. I'm going to keep, well, it looks like we've got some big, actually, it's kind of all over the board. I would say it's a little bit all over the board relative to the totals here, but it looks like there are a lot of you that are managing a lot of grants. I would say greater than 11. Looks like somewhere between 11 and 40 is kind of leading the way here. So that poll will remain open. You've got a little bit more time on that, but we're just going to keep moving through just in the interest of time relative to the webinar. So the next common challenge I'm going to spend a little bit of time on is really budget management. And I'm certain that all of you can understand the couple of major challenges here, and that's aligning spending with budgets and then managing costs and allocations. I will say that one of the number one things that we work on with clients is really managing those costs and allocations, whether they're salary allocations, whether they're, various shared cost allocations. But a couple of best practices, we've talked before, those of you that maybe have heard me talk before about, financial tracking tools for budget monitoring, having the right systems, and then building a consistent methodology and shared cost structure. So let's dive a little bit deeper into both of those. From the budget management side, obviously the best practice is monitoring your revenue spending and your budgets as you're going along, not just spending, to be able to have your pulse on the visibility into what expenses are you incurring and, making sure you're monitoring those to the budget for that particular grant. Many grants, and it sounds like a lot of you are involved with government grants, they repay. You're not getting an upfront dollar amount from on a lot of the state and federal government grants. Some of them you may, not all of them. So it's very important to keep a watchful eye on expenses, budget, and the impact it has on cash flow pretty much at all times. You don't want to submit for an expense and find out it doesn't qualify. Similarly, you don't want to overspend and find out that you're at a point where you've maximized your grant and contract. And for those of you, obviously, that are working with more than one, it's really tracking and monitoring your spending on multiple grants. One of the trickiest things is that systems becomes very critical. And you'll hear us talk about systems. Amanda will talk about technology in a little bit as well, but you have to have visibility. I've seen so many organizations that pull data out of an archaic system and then try to use spreadsheets to allocate salaries, to allocate various costs and shared costs and so on. So finding the systems that are going to make the most sense for your organization, because comparing budget to actual isn't just fiscal year. You all know the budget, it'd be great if someone could come out with a rule that says every single grant contract has to be on the same time period and everyone's fiscal years were the same. That world doesn't exist. So tracking all of those various time periods and knowing that they're not consistent with your fiscal year, that's one of the most important pieces. So monitoring that revenue spending and budgets and utilizing the right system to tag and track data and information. And then secondarily, as far as budget management goes, is really focusing on building a consistent methodology and a shared cost structure. So all of you are aware of the various types of costs. We have direct costs, which the direct costs are always the easiest ones to track and to monitor, because those are very specific. You've gone to the funder, you said you want this position to be covered, that position is being covered in full. It's usually a dedicated staff person, might be specific equipment, very specific line items by a single project or a single grant. So a little bit easier from the standpoint of direct costs. Shared starts to get a little sticky. These are required to carry out a grant, but are difficult to attribute to a very specific grant, because you have things such as, office space, you've got utilities, things that obviously all of you that are in the organization are utilizing these, but they're important because you need the space, or you need, program space or whatever that is to carry out the work that's being done there. So it's not easy to allocate these costs to different programs. And so those are the kind of things from a shared cost policy. We'll get into that in just a moment. The third cost, the indirect costs, these are all the costs that aren't readily identifiable specific to a grant. So these are all the things that would be your cost, really more overhead type items. So all of your costs for your HR department, or really where there isn't, that person's not working specifically on a program. You can't say their time is 10% or 3% or 8% or whatever it is and allocate it in that capacity. So this is where you'll see a lot of times either funders allowing for, and/or the state and federal grantors allowing for, used to be a 10% de minimis, that's moved to 15% in many cases. That kind of is a percentage that's allowed to be applied in total to the contract that does cover some of those expenses. And then finally, the disallowed costs, which really are legitimate expenses to an organization. They're not disallowed from the organization standpoint, but a specific funder may not allow them. And I've seen instances where funders will not allow for lobbying to be paid for. I've seen where funders are very specific about not paying for food costs. Like, there are things that a funder may not want to be paying for at all. So you just have to be mindful of those when you're kind of planning these things out. And then the second part, really establishing and maintaining a shared cost policy. This is extremely important. There is no one single correct method for allocating shared costs. You just have to make sure that it's clear on how your organization has decided to do it. It really helps to ensure your project funds are used wisely and that you're distributing costs fairly. And there's various methods. For example, some organizations will use number of employees, take total number of employees, how many are working on a specific grant or contract, and divide that way. Some will use square footage. How much square footage does this program take up? And what types of costs are we going to accumulate and allocate based on that percentage? And we've also seen revenue. Someone look at all of these shared costs and dividing the total revenue per grant by that, feeling like, okay, well, it's a bigger grant versus a smaller grant. That's a fairer way to do it. So again, it's really establishing what works for your organization using one or more of those methodologies. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Amanda to take you through the next common challenges.
Great. Thank you, Jen. So another common challenge nonprofits face relative to their grant funding is tracking and reporting their data. So specifically, some of those challenges can be caused in part by inefficient systems for monitoring the grant information. So for example, an organization might have a variety of systems that track different aspects of the overall process. So a general accounting software, project management tools, and maybe external spreadsheets. And when all of those systems are not integrated, tracking your grant financial information can become very fragmented and cumbersome. And especially when there are a lot of those Excel spreadsheets that Jen was referring to earlier, that leads to a lot of manual input, manual reconciliation between these different platforms, and that can be time consuming for your staff and more prone to errors. Organizations also deal with the commingled org-wide expenses. So as Jen just alluded to, finding a way to allocate those shared expenses using a clear methodology. Otherwise, it can be difficult to really know how much of your expenses are assigned to each of your grants. And then there's also difficulties in generating those detailed, accurate financial reports. So like Jen said, if you've met one funder, you've only met one funder. There's different funding requirements, different time periods that you're going to be tracking. So having your data available by all those means to break down the information, in a way that each funder is requiring can be challenging. So on the next slide, we have a couple best practices regarding this. So nonprofits with grants really need an accounting system that's capable of capturing both those direct expenses and the indirect costs accurately so that you can bill back to your grantors for reimbursement. When it comes time to voucher or report back, you really want to be able to easily gather all your charges, bill them back to your grantor with essentially a click of a button. So tagging all of those transactions when you enter them into your systems can really reduce the errors so that you're not going back after the fact and potentially missing a charge or overstating your amounts. And then establishing that cost allocation plan that Jen referred to is important. This is going to ensure consistency. And sometimes accounting systems have the capability to perform those allocations, and using that is going to automate the process and really minimize that human error, reducing the administrative workload of your people and increasing the speed at which your data can be collected and reported. So moving to the next slide, nonprofits also want to track KPIs and automate that grantor reporting because this is going to demonstrate your organization's mission impact as well as its financial accountability to your funders. So again, with that modern technology, it's going to be easier to produce those required reports for each of your different funders and monitor your KPIs just due to the amount of real-time information that you're going to have at your fingertips. KPIs are also a great way to keep a pulse on your organization and your mission. So you can use this information to elevate your story, maximize your engagement with your current grantors and constituents, as well as potential future donors. So tied in closely to data tracking and reporting is going to be challenges with technology. So organizations that are using those inefficient or outdated grant management tools and general ledger softwares are going to experience a lack of automation and streamlining, because those outdated tools tend to heavily rely on manual data entry, which is going to slow down the process and again can lead to more errors. Without the automation, these organizations can struggle to track the full scope of your expenses, really know when milestones are being hit, and better manage those funds across multiple grants. So this leads to delays in processing for your reimbursements and just increases your risk of misallocation. And then also when there's that lack of integration between your budget tracking, your performance tracking, your compliance tracking across the organization, when those are managed through separate, unintegrated systems, your data can become very siloed. And this means that the teams working in these different areas cannot easily share information, which makes it difficult to really track how the project is performing and to ensure that spending is aligned with the terms of a grant. So just for example, there might have been certain programmatic changes that occurred within a budget, but if that isn't communicated back to, let's say, the finance folks and how that changed the budget, they might be misreporting and not even realize it. So we will talk about a best practice as far as some of these technology challenges on the next slide. And that is really going to be to invest in a modern cloud-based technology solution. So implementing these new user-friendly integrated management systems can streamline your tracking, reporting, and financial management. There are tools that are designed specifically for grant accounting, and that offers specialized features that meet different funders' requirements and can improve your overall operational efficiency. And when you adopt a centralized system that's going to link the budgeting component, the performance tracking, and compliance management, it's going to ensure that all of your relevant data is accessible and accurate across the organization. And again, reduce those inconsistencies and better enable you to forecast and plan for the future. So organizations will want to go through the steps that are listed here on the screen when investing in a new technology solution. And that's really going to start with a needs assessment to understand the organization's current pain points in its financial tracking and compliance, and really look at any specific features that might be required, whether that's how much real-time reporting you want, do you have certain role-based access controls that you want to integrate into the system. So you want to research your options and really ensure that there's scalability to accommodate organizational growth and the increasing data or complexities that come with grants. You'll want to conduct your vendor evaluations, really being sure to look at criteria such as its user friendliness, how much customization they offer, are there integration capabilities, and its customer support. And we also always recommend some demos and trial periods to test the platform before committing. We also recommend creating a budget for implementation for the ongoing licensing and maintenance that might come with these solutions, and then project the return on investment. And when you're calculating that, being sure to take into account the reduced administrative burden on your people, the improved accuracy you're going to see, and just the better compliance that's going to come from this investment in the technology solution. And then lastly, develop a phased rollout plan to really try to minimize your disruptions and ensure a smooth adoption.
And I'm going to come off mute for a second. In the chat, someone has asked about, what are some of the systems? And, from our vantage point, those of you maybe heard us talk before, we work a lot with Sage Intacct. It's really it's really elevated its game from the standpoint of allowing for, like Amanda was talking about the cost, both myself and Amanda were talking about the cost allocations. That's one of, I would say, the top. It's the AICPA's preferred software, and the AICPA is the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants that we're kind of governed by. They've done all the tests on the software, so that's our go-to. We're not sales pitching it. We don't get paid to sell Intacct by any means, but from a software system that we've seen be top-notch from the standpoint of delivering services that we provide from an outsourced capacity, but also some of our audit partners that work with clients that do utilize Sage Intacct. There are others. I think the number one thing that I would stress that's on this slide is cloud-based. Most of the cloud-based softwares do have AI capability, or they have the capability to link to grant management softwares, but happy to talk more if anyone wants to reach out and talk more about, actual specific software options. Both Amanda and I'd be happy to do that. But it's Sage Intacct. I saw someone ask the name of it. Sage Intacct is really who one of our go-tos. We see a lot of organizations trying to use QuickBooks, and it becomes quite challenging to do that without all of that data being pulled out and done manually. So that's really the number one for us, but there are others as well.
All right, I believe if you move to the next slide, Jen, it's going to be our next polling question. So are you currently utilizing a cloud-based financial management system? Yes, no, or I am not sure. So just giving you all a little time to fill out the poll. It looks pretty even, honestly, between yes and no. A few of you aren't sure, but split pretty evenly between yes and no. All right, so continuing on. So shifting away from data and technology challenges into more of the resource constraints that organizations face. So many nonprofits have smaller teams. They might lack the specialized knowledge or have limited capacity to handle the increasing complexity that we're seeing in grant regulations, compliance, and reporting. So this can lead to inefficiencies, missed deadlines, or errors in the grant management process, especially as the number of grants that an organization has to manage keeps increasing. So we'll talk about best practices on the next page, but I actually first want to just touch on the best practice about advocating for overhead in grant proposals. So organizations really want to ensure that proposals are accounting for the costs of the grant administration, whether that is staffing, reporting, compliance. And by including this administrative overhead in the budget, organizations can ensure that they are given the resources to manage your grants effectively without having to compromise other operations or having to cover those costs with those coveted general operation dollars. So we suggest very clearly articulating the need for administrative overhead when you're writing grant proposals and trying to align the need for that overhead to the funder's priorities and the goals of the overall grant. So if a grantor really prioritizes effective monitoring, explain in your proposal how being able to monitor the program really requires having specialized staff or a specialized system, and that those needs require funding. So with that, we can move to the next page, which is going to get more.
I was going to say, I'm going to jump in and underscore what you just said. And I kind of mentioned it earlier, even if asking for it in your regular grants or asking for it in capacity building, a lot of these technology solutions, I have nonprofits all the time say, well, that they sound great, but they're expensive. And that's true. But what we're seeing, like Amanda said, and I said earlier, more and more funders being willing to, you're linking, listen, if you want this data and outcomes in this manner, we need some help with this capacity building. We need some help with the technology. We need those dollars. So glad from an underscore, I'll underscore, what she just said again, the worst thing they can say is no and limit what they're giving you the funding for, but you absolutely never hurts to ask. So, great point there.
All right, so best practice as far as resource constraints. Grant management takes a ton of time and energy, so it's very important to task the right people with this job. You really want to designate passionate and experienced staff from different key functional areas. So that's going to include your fundraising team, project management, leadership, finance, and provide all of them with the right tools and technology. And it's really important to foster this collaboration across departments, because sometimes we think of grant accounting as just the finance piece, but it really is a broader team across your organization. And by empowering this cross-functional team, you're going to, again, break down those silos of information and create a more cohesive approach to your grant management process. You'll also be able to really leverage your team members' strengths by assigning different tasks based on their expertise. So the budget stays with the finance department, but focusing on those deliverables lays with your project teams. So this is really the issue that we have seen the most. This is the biggest problem for organizations, is just struggling on the people side and just seeing constant turnover, especially in that finance related position. So some organizations will go out and get those great technologies that we've been talking about, but without the right team of consistent people to execute on it and to understand the grant cycle, it becomes really challenging. So we encourage organizations to really explore a mix of internal staffing, external consultants, or a hybrid of these teams to be able to address gaps in expertise as well as capacity and really find what works best for your organization. So empowering the best team in this context really means equipping the team with the tools and support and autonomy they need to manage your grant resources effectively, which will ultimately lead to better financial oversight, reduced errors, and improve outcomes for not just your organization, but your funders. So with that, I will hand it back to you, Jen.
Thanks, Amanda. So the last couple of common challenges and best practices, this next one up is compliance and regulatory. And, again, you'll see common themes through most of these. I mean, obviously navigating the grant guidelines and reporting requirements, not just on the financial side. We've talked a lot about the financial systems and limitations and issues and allocations, but also on just compliance with federal, state, and donor-specific regulations. There are things outside of finance. A lot of it's finance-driven, but there are other items as well. And so we already talked about, choosing the right grant management software and the right financial software and really spending time on that. But some of the other best practices, such as providing staff with the right training. And what does that look like? It really looks like organizing, regular training sessions for all of the key staff, like Amanda mentioned. It's not just finance, it's not just program, it's everybody who's involved, so that people understand what are the grant guidelines. And it's hard to do when there are so many different grants, but to be able to break that down or give general overviews of how important it is to be aware of the grant that you're working on. What are those grant guidelines that you need to be following, and best practices? A lot of times it's best practices on documentation. You may have a, grant management software or you may be using, I see a lot of organizations use Salesforce, and it's like, well, what do we have to document? People are unclear on that. So really making sure that your staff is trained and understand their role in the grants management cycle, and then ensuring that they understand how it ties to compliance tracking. And then not just training them once, periodically circling back and providing refreshers, keeping people updated on changes that occur. Same thing with on the compliance side. I know a lot of organizations may not have a chief compliance officer. So it really ends up falling on leadership and the program teams to ensure compliance very specific to a grant. Conducting periodic internal audits. So I know I say this coming right off of resource constraints. It's like, okay, great, add one more thing to the things that we don't have a person to necessarily do. But this does not mean formal internal audits. You don't have to hire a Bonadio or another firm or someone to perform these internal audits. This is just kind of looking at your all of the grants that you have, your sphere of all of the funding sources, contracts, and really looking at maybe identifying the higher areas of risk and having someone independent go and take a read through your grant contract, or looking at a funder's requirement, and just ensuring that you are complying, and that things are being done efficiently, that the funds are being used appropriately. And it can just be little checks here and there. This isn't intended to be, again, a major process and adding another person in internal audit. It's just a best practice. Not everybody can do these things, but when you can, it helps to identify gaps or issues up front especially maybe if it's a new type of funding. Maybe you're really used to government grants and contracts and you're navigating your first, private foundation grant, or vice versa. You've been in the private foundation grant space forever, but not had a government grant, just those kind of things. And if you do need to lean on a resource provider, you have somebody that you feel like can help you. Again, it doesn't have to be super complex or time consuming. And then really one of the things I realized after when we were putting this together, I didn't put a bullet on this particular one, but creating a continuous improvement process, making sure all those individuals who are involved in the grant cycle, that you're communicating with them and that you're seeking feedback from them on, is the software that you're using really helpful? Like, are they struggling in the software? Is it not user friendly? Are there other challenges or improvements that could enhance tracking? Are they seeing something out there that could work better than what you're doing? Staying up to date on changes that are going on, compliance changes and standards and regulations, and also taking funder feedback. So sometimes one of the things I think from a continuous improvement process is funders that you may not be awarded a grant, but you may be provided with some incredible feedback on what you can do better next time. So it's kind of just getting in that mindset from compliance and regulatory of always wanting to continuously improve and do better and more for your organizations. And then the last common challenge and best practices that we're going to talk about today really focuses on impact measurement. And what we've seen here, so again, we talked a lot today on the finance side, but also when you start to look at impact measurement, what are the challenges? Quantifying and demonstrating project outcomes. And then again, right, comes back to insufficient resources in order to really thoroughly provide the impact assessment that a lot of the funders and government agencies are looking for. It's not just we served 100 families. It's what did you do? How did you help to move them from one place to the next? I mean, they want way more data and information than they ever have before. So from a best practice standpoint, one of the first bullets there talks about engaging third-party evaluators for unbiased impact assessments. I'm sure all of you are hearing dollar signs. Well, that costs money, Jen. And one of the other things I would say, to Amanda's point earlier about asking for overhead items, this is another area that I've seen more government agencies and funders begin to allow organizations to put into their grant requests, asking for, if you really want, and again, it depends on what your program is, if you really want this unbiased assessment and outcomes, it might be most helpful to hire a third-party evaluator. And then for those of you that are going out to seek a third-party evaluator, you really want to partner with someone who's independent, who has experience in your sector. I've seen this go awry a couple of times where you have a great evaluator who's not familiar with, maybe the homeless, unhoused population. And so that then becomes an issue that's not something they're as familiar with. So making sure they work in your sector and understand the work that you do. Defining expectations and deliverables in those contracts with those individuals, and then really encouraging the evaluators to be impartial and giving them access. This is another thing I've seen an issue with, giving them access to the data, the resources, and the stakeholders. This is a situation where having stakeholder interviews, it's not just you coming out and telling your funder what you've done, it's actually conversations with stakeholders that's all put into a nice report. Again, sounds wonderful. It has a cost to it, but try and get those costs. I would encourage you to get those costs into your grant asks where possible. The second is really adopting a framework, like a results-based management RBM of some source for consistent evaluation. So with an RBM type structure, you're looking at like the SMART. So you want it to be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound objectives for your grant program. Designating, you've heard us talk about key performance indicators when you decide what those KPIs are, and then you have these great systems in place that can kind of spit out those KPIs as you're going along. RBM really emphasizes that results-oriented reporting. It allows for qualitative and also quantitative outcomes with funders, and it's a great tool to capture the lessons learned, and leads very nicely into the last bullet, which is when possible, from an impact measurement standpoint, using data visualization tools to communicate results. from a funder, from even, government grants and contracts, some of them it's very specific. Here's the form we want you to put the data and information in, you call it a day. Others really thrive on receiving, I don't want to say flashy to a degree, but taking that data and information and elevating it into charts and graphs and narratives that really tells a story instead of just raw data. It really gives a narrative that ties the data you're providing to the outcomes. How you may have helped 100 families, but what did you really do for those 100 families? Did the scale of their hope increase from one, other measurable items that funders are really looking for? And those data visualization tools, we're seeing more and more organizations and funders really interested in utilizing them. And I'm going to go ahead and launch polling question number 4. We are getting close to the end of our time here. A couple more slides to get through. So this one just asks about your current situation. Is your whole grants management process automated, including all financial aspects, allocations to vouchering? We have only automated the non-financial portion of grants management. We're not automated at all. In fact, we're completely bogged down in spreadsheets and out of the financial system, error-prone allocations. And, no judgment on any of these because we've seen every single scenario. And I will tell you that there aren't many we've experienced where everything is fully automated. There are individuals in so many different phases of automation. Maybe you've got the financial system. I saw a bunch of you talk. NetSuite is another one of the cloud-based systems that we see with grants capabilities. I've seen some of you mentioned going from things like Great Plains into NetSuite. So I know a lot of you maybe focused on the financial side and making those moves, but whether or not the grant management side is automated as well. And I'll tell you, I saw someone had asked in the chat about finding the right grant management software. It's a lot harder. It's easier for us to recommend on the financial side what we've seen work because that's the systems that we're working in more often. I have actually not seen one grant management system that I would say is like perfect. I think there's just a lot of various tools you can use to do that. But if you do deploy one, I've seen several organizations actually use Salesforce, which for me, you thought Salesforce was actually meant to track more of the CRM side than anything else, but all those softwares are customizable. So the biggest takeaway to doing any sort of, managing or automating and managing the grant specific side more so than the financial side really is the customization to your organization. You got to find a solution and customize it. Nothing's really out of the box going to be a one size fits all organizations. And so finally, just a couple of items of what's on the horizon. And actually what I realized was earlier, Amanda had kind of the future trend slide. This kind of aligns with that, but it's probably a really good way to wrap up where we are all together, circling back to a couple of these. But what we're seeing happening more and more is the increased use of technology and automation, but not just technology like we've talked about. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around everything. Every time I hear someone say AI, but there are tools that are already starting to emerge for AI-powered tools for grant discovery and application streamlining. I think we're all kind of dabbling in this world right now, but there's a lot of opportunity for AI to kind of change how we look at the grants management process going forward. Focusing on outcomes and impact. We've talked a lot about this. There's just going to be a greater focus. So to the last couple of slides relative to data visualization and those types of areas, super important going forward. The sustainability focused funding, this is an interesting one that I have really started to see where funders are prioritizing organizations, even large contracts and grants across the state and federal government are starting to prioritize not only organizations with the organizations that have sustainability plans, ones that aren't just looking at them for all of their funding, that they are being diversified. The organizations and funders don't want to be your sole source of funding or one that you're constantly going back to. They want to see that you've got other things going on. And then the last couple, equity and inclusion in grant making, we've actually seen a lot more support for underrepresented communities and small grassroots organizations. Some of the large funders have really looked to some of these smaller organizations and given a little bit more funding that way. And I've actually seen some great partnerships between some of the small grassroots organizations and larger nonprofits kind of coming together. So when Amanda talked earlier about that collaboration and that really being an important thing going forward, they're really looking for that collaborative multi-sector partnerships, not only with big and small nonprofits, not only with ones that are in similar funding spaces, kind of coming together and making an ask together, but also ones that kind of are happening between nonprofits, government, and even, private entities, for-profit entities, and finding a way for all three to kind of come together to solve some of the, if it's a health and human service issue or whatever it might be, but working together very collaboratively is pretty much what we're seeing on the horizon. So we have come to the end of our time today. I want to thank all of you for being with us today. We hope you found the session informative and insightful, and that I mentioned earlier, all of the presentation materials as well as a recording of our webinar will be sent to you within 2 weeks. If you have any inquiries or you have any questions, I know we covered a lot of ground today in a short period of time and tried to answer the questions as we could kind of see them popping up in the chat. But if there's anything specific, don't hesitate to reach out to Amanda or myself, or even your other Bonadeo representatives. I know a lot of you are connected to the firm in some capacity. So, feel free to reach out. They can get in touch with us, or you can get in touch with your Bonadeo team. And then I mentioned earlier, and I'll say it again, there are so many great sessions this week, later today, and every day as the week goes on. I know we shared the link in the chat, but also being able to go to our Bonadeo website. And we're very excited about seeing you at future sessions this week. I know I'm excited about participating and listening to some of my colleagues, and hope that you're excited to do the same. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you again.